We often talk about the big numbers in business, the big challenges, but today we're plunging into a really crucial space where they meet head on.
Yeah, it's about how companies actually measure and report their impact on the living world. The whole biodiversity and ecosystems piece.
Exactly. We're talking specifically about reporting on biodiversity and ecosystems.
And for this deep dive, our source material is, well, it's a really detailed look into one specific set of disclosure requirements, ESRS E4, European Sustainability Reporting Standard E4.
Right, part of that big EU push for transparency.
Exactly.
So our mission really is to take the standard, ESRS E4, which can look pretty dense, and unpack it a bit. What are companies actually being asked to tell us about, their relationship with nature?
And crucially, why does it matter to you if you're trying to understand the real footprint of a business?
Because this isn't just like abstract environmental rules, is it?
Not at all. It's a framework that's really designed to make businesses face up to their actual physical impact, positive and negative, now and in the future.
On the whole web of life.
Yeah, impacts on species, on habitats, entire ecosystems, and importantly, it also explicitly includes impacts on indigenous peoples and local communities, those whose lives are often deeply connected to nature.
Okay, so let's get into the standard then, ESRS E4. What's the main goal? What are they trying to achieve with this?
Well, the core objective is pretty straightforward, actually. It's to give users of a company's report, think investors, customers, regulators, you listening, a clear picture.
A clear picture of how that company affects biodiversity and ecosystems.
Exactly. And that means looking at all their material impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities connected to nature.
Material being the key word there, stuff that's actually significant, either to the business or to the environment.
Precisely. And the scope, well, it's huge. It covers land, freshwater, marine environments, everything.
And it's not just about the direct harm they might cause.
No, that's a critical point. It also requires them to disclose how they contribute to those bigger, wider trends of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation.
And it's not just looking backward, right? It's forward-looking, too.
Absolutely crucial. They need to talk about the actions they are taking now, sure, but also their plans. How are they going to adapt their whole strategy, their business model, based on understanding these nature impacts and dependencies?
Which brings us to the money side.
Yep. The standard makes them report on the anticipated financial effects, the risks and the opportunities that come from this whole relationship with nature.
What's really striking here is how this standard forces that connection. Business model meets, well, the health of the planet.
Right. Biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation. They're not these distant environmental issues anymore. The standard frames them as creating very real material risks and opportunities for businesses.
Like what kind of things?
Oh, everything from, say, supply chain disruption because a key resource disappears, to maybe new market opportunities in ecological restoration.
Makes sense. And our source material points out how integrated this is. It links up with other reporting areas.
Yeah, connects directly to disclosures on climate change, obviously, but also pollution, water use, resource use, the circular economy stuff.
And then the social impacts, too. You mentioned affected communities.
Yes, that link is really strong. Often, these are the people who depend most directly on local biodiversity, local ecosystems for their livelihoods, their culture. Their well-being is tied up in this.
And this isn't just happening in isolation, is it? It connects to bigger global targets.
Exactly. The standard explicitly references alignment with major international agreements, like the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework.
The big one from COP15.
That's the one. And also regional ones like the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. And it grounds itself in science, referencing things like planetary boundaries.
Planetary boundaries like biosphere integrity, land system change, these big ecological limits.
Right. It's about getting companies to recognize formally that business operates within these natural limits.
Okay, let's dive into the actual core areas then. What do companies have to report on? Starting with strategy, ESRS E4-1, I think it is?
Yep, E4-1. And ESRS just stands for European Sustainability Reporting Standards, for anyone keeping track. This section asks companies about their transition plan for biodiversity and ecosystems.
So how nature fits into their big picture strategy and their business model.
Yes, exactly. They need to show how they're adapting their fundamental way of doing business based on the impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities they've figured out.
And here's where it gets really, really interesting. They have to talk about the resilience of that strategy.
Can their business model actually cope if nature keeps degrading? Or if policies suddenly get much stricter? It's a tough question.
Thinking about those physical risks, maybe, like extreme weather hitting your facilities because nearby forests that offer protection are gone.
As a classic physical risk, yeah. Or transition risks, new regulations popping up, consumers suddenly boycotting products linked to deforestation, that sort of thing. Reputational damage.
And this strategy section is where they explain how their plan helps meet those global biodiversity goals and respects those planetary boundaries we mentioned.
Precisely. It's showing they have a credible plan to align their business with, well, a nature-positive future, ideally.
Okay, so how do they even begin to figure out what their material impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities are? That sounds like a massive task.
It is. And that links to another core part of the standards, ESRS 2, IRO 1, Impact, Risk, and Opportunity Management.
Right, IR1, that's where they explain their process, isn't it? How they actually do the homework to identify and assess what's material.
Exactly. And they need to think across different timescales,
Yeah.
short, medium, long term. What matters next year versus what matters in, say, 20 years.
And our source mentions specific types of risks they need to hunt for.
Yeah, it breaks them down. You've got the physical risks, like we mentioned, supply chains disrupted by floods, droughts made worse by land degradation.
Okay.
Then transition risks, policy shifts, market changes, maybe technology shifts towards nature-friendly alternative or reputational hits. And critically, it also mentions systemic risks, like the cascading consequences. If a major ecosystem, maybe a vital fishery or a rainforest, actually collapses, the ripple effects.
Wow. And you mentioned dependencies before, that businesses actually rely on nature.
Absolutely fundamental. Think about any company using timber or cotton or relying on clean water or even insect pollination for its agricultural inputs. Those are direct dependencies on ecosystem services.
So if those services decline.
Their business model is directly under threat. Simple as that.
And a key part of identifying all this is talking to people, right? Consultation.
Yes, very important. Engaging with affected communities, suppliers, scientists, NGOs. They often have crucial on-the-ground knowledge about impacts and dependencies that a company might miss from its headquarters.
And companies might even need to do scenario analysis, like what if exercises.
Yeah, disclose biodiversity and ecosystem scenario analysis. Testing how different future states of nature or different policy pathways could affect their business. Stress testing their strategy, essentially.
Okay, moving on. Policies. ESRS E4 requires them to disclose the policies they've actually adopted related to biodiversity and ecosystems.
Right. This is about the rules and principles they set internally to guide their actions.
And these policies should directly tackle how they plan to manage those material impacts, risks, dependencies, opportunities they found in the previous step.
Exactly. Connecting the dots.
And there's a really fundamental principle highlighted here, the mitigation hierarchy.
Yes. This is absolutely central. You'll see it referenced again and again. The policies must prioritize avoidance of negative impacts first and foremost. Don't cause the harm in the first place.
Avoidance first.
Then, if you absolutely can't avoid it, you minimize the impact as much as possible.
Okay.
Only after you've done everything to avoid and minimize do you look at restoring any damage caused.
Restoration comes third.
And right at the bottom, as a last resort, comes offsetting unavoidable residual impacts, buying credits or funding protection elsewhere.
So it's a clear cascade: avoid, minimize, restore, offset, AOMR.
Precisely. Avoid first, offset last. That hierarchy is key.
Because trying to fix or offset damage later is often way harder, more expensive, or sometimes just impossible compared to preventing it initially.
Exactly right. And the standard says these policies should, ideally, be based on good science and involve stakeholder input where it makes sense.
They can also cover other things, like traceability.
Yeah, ensuring they know where their materials come from, especially high-risk commodities, and also considering the social consequences of their activities on biodiversity and ecosystems. It's all linked.
Okay, policies are great, but you need action. ESRS E43 is about putting the rubber on the road, right? The actual actions and the resources.
Spot on. This section is where they disclose the concrete steps they're taking to implement those policies. What are they doing?
And again, structured around that mitigation hierarchy.
Yes. What specific actions are they taking to avoid impacts, to minimize them, to restore ecosystems, or, as a last resort, to offset? They need to detail that.
And measure success, KPIs.
Yeah. Key performance indicators for these actions.
Yeah.
And crucially, the financial side, the costs, the investments involved in these actions. How are they resourcing this?
And it calls out actions in sensitive areas specifically.
Yes, disclosures are particularly important for actions taken in biodiversity-sensitive areas, hotspots, protected areas, places critical for ecosystem services.
And they also need to explain how their actions might contribute to, like, wider system change, not just fixing their own little patch.
Right. How does what they're doing contribute to broader positive outcomes for nature? It encourages thinking beyond just compliance.
So policies, actions, how do they track if any of this is actually working, moving towards a nature-positive goal? That brings us to targets and metrics, E44 and E45.
Exactly. Companies need to disclose their specific, measurable targets related to biodiversity and ecosystems.
Targets that should link back to their policies and actions.
Yes, and ideally contribute to those bigger global and EU goals we talked about earlier. You could even have targets based on the mitigation hierarchy.
Like a target to avoid development in X% of high biodiversity value areas.
Precisely. Or a target for restoring a certain area of degraded land.
Okay, so those are the targets. And metrics are how they measure progress towards those targets.
Yep. ESRS E4 asks for specific impact metrics. The source gives quite a few examples.
Yeah, give us a few, maybe make them a bit more concrete.
Sure. Things like changes in land cover over time. So measuring hectares of deforestation linked to their supply chain, or maybe land converted for mining, versus hectares they've helped restore.
Okay, land cover. What else?
Changes in how ecosystems are managed, like tracking the percentage of agricultural land under sustainable practices, or forestry areas certified to certain standards.
Management practices, got it.
Also, changes in spatial configuration, fancy term, but it basically means how habitats are connected or broken up. So measuring habitat fragmentation caused by, say, a new pipeline, or maybe metrics on efforts to create wildlife corridors.
Like that road cutting through a forest example. Makes it harder for animals.
Exactly. Then there are metrics on impact drivers like tracking the spread of invasive alien species if their operations might be contributing to that. And metrics on threatened species themselves. Are populations going up or down? Is the extinction risk changing for species in areas they impact?
And just general species diversity, like counting species.
Yeah, broader measures like species richness, how many different types or abundance, how many individuals in the areas they affect, though, as you can imagine.
Measuring species diversity across a global company's footprint sounds incredibly complex.
It really is. Which is why the standard stresses focusing metrics on the material impacts, especially in those sensitive areas. And transparency is key.
Transparency about how they measure.
Exactly. What methods did they use? Was the data primary stuff they collected themselves, secondary from external sources, or was it based on modeling? They need to disclose that.
Okay, nearly there. Last big piece, the money again. ESRS E46, anticipated financial effects.
Right. This loops back to the beginning. Companies have to disclose the expected financial impacts, positive and negative, short, medium, long term, that they anticipate could arise from those material nature-related risks and opportunities they identify.
And this needs to connect directly to their actual financial statements. Position, performance, cash flows.
That's the goal. Make that link explicit. The standard pushes for quantified financial information if possible. Put a number on it.
But acknowledges that might be hard.
Yeah, it allows for qualitative information if quantification isn't feasible or perhaps material at this stage. But the intent is clear. Connect nature to the financial health of the company.
Okay, wow. So let's try and bring this all together for you listening. We've taken quite a deep dive into ESRS E4.
We look at its core goal, transparency on nature impacts, its broad scope, land, water, communities, and the key reporting pillars it sets up.
Right. How companies weave nature into their strategy.
How they identify and manage impacts, risks, and opportunities.
The policies they set, guided by that crucial mitigation hierarchy.
The concrete actions they take and resources they commit.
The targets and metrics they use to track progress.
And finally, the bottom line, the anticipated financial implications.
So why should you care about all these, frankly, quite detailed requirements?
Because they give you a framework. Knowing these categories means you can look at a company's sustainability report when these ESRS reports start coming out and understand what they should be telling you.
It helps you see where they're focusing, maybe where the gaps are.
Exactly. It gives you a lens to evaluate how seriously they're taking their relationship with nature. It empowers you, really, to ask more informed, specific questions about their impact.
So the key takeaway from this deep dive, ESRS E4 is a pretty significant step, wouldn't you say?
I think so. It pushes companies way beyond just vague green statements. It forces a structured, comprehensive way of thinking about their interaction with biodiversity and ecosystems.
And crucially, it links environmental impact directly to core business stuff, strategy, risk, finance.
It really tries to make nature a material business issue, hardwiring it into corporate reporting. That's the aim.
Which leaves us with maybe a final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Oh, boy.
Given how incredibly complex it is to measure something as dynamic, as intricate as biodiversity and the health of countless different ecosystems all over the world,
Yeah.
how much can even a detailed standard like ESRS E4 truly capture the full nuance, the deep interconnectedness, and the real urgency of nature loss?
That's the big question, isn't it?
And will these disclosures, however detailed we make them, actually be enough on their own to drive the kind of massive transformative action that science tells us is needed to reverse these trends? Or is it just one piece of a much larger puzzle?